You're watching Kitco News. I'm Michelle Makori. There have been major developments out of China this week with potential ramifications for the globe and the markets. China has brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the two longtime foes now agreeing to re-establish diplomatic relations. This is a big jolt to alignments in the Middle East and positions China as a power player in the region. And this comes as Xi Jinping begins his historic third term as China's president and has also called for more quickly elevating the armed forces to world-class standards. Meanwhile, China's new foreign minister is warning that conflict and confrontation with the United States is inevitable if Washington does not change course. Meanwhile, in the U.S., federal agencies, including the FBI, are saying that it is most likely that COVID-19 did in fact come from the Wuhan lab in China. And the House has voted unanimously to declassify U.S. intelligence information about the origins of COVID-19. The Chinese government has responded to that act by calling it political manipulation. Congress, meanwhile, is also debating Chinese social media app TikTok and a potential ban there. And the Biden administration has imposed new sanctions against Chinese companies for supplying parts for Iranian drones used by Russia to fight its war in Ukraine. China, meanwhile, is trying to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, while continuing to send strong signals to Taiwan, launching 25 warplanes and 3 warships towards the island nation this week. And those are just some of the developments over the past few days. Let's break this down and what this means for investors with Michael Wilkerson. Michael is the founder of Stormwall Advisors and the author of the recently published book, Why America Matters, A Case for a New Exceptionalism. Michael, welcome back to Kitco.
Michelle, great to be with you today.
All right, Michael, a lot of developments out of China to get your analysis on. But let's first start with this restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by Beijing. Tehran and Riyadh agreeing to reestablish embassies in each other's capitals. They both also affirmed non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. They've agreed that their foreign ministers will hold a summit soon to hammer out the exact details of this deal. Now, Tehran and Riyadh have been estranged for 7+ years, but even prior to that, they've had strained relationships, especially given the Shiite-Sunni rift between the two countries. Now, this is clearly a diplomatic victory for Beijing in a region where the U.S. has long dominated geopolitics. But just how significant is this agreement?
I think on this one, only time will tell. This is a relationship, this very strange bedfellows. You've pointed out a couple things. First of all, they vie for geopolitical power within the region. Underlying that geopolitical conflict is a deeply cultural-seated animosity between the Shiites and the Sunni Muslims in these countries. And at best of times, this relationship has been very difficult and frosty. We have a moment of warming after years of proxy wars in Syria and other places. So I think it is important. Iran is needing very much to get back into the international community. Saudi Arabia is warming to China and to Russia at the expense of its relationship with the U.S. And I think importantly, beyond those two countries, well, I will say one thing. It is, you mentioned a risk to Israel. I think it is a concern. Israel is constantly in the state of conflict in the region, is the only democracy surrounded by Islamic law nations that are hostile to its interests. So I don't think it goes in the positive camp for them. What's interesting to me is the role that China has played here. They are moving up a level in the great power strategy and their role in the world as being arbiter and broker of these peace agreements, something that historically a role that would have been left for the U.S. And I think it does reflect both their aspirations, but also the substantive role that they are playing in the region. China has been the most important buyer of crude for Iran during this period. And it follows on the heels of China also proposing a ceasefire and a peace solution for the Ukrainian conflict. If I may, on that one, what was very interesting to me about China's approach was they had 12 points for peace. Some of them were things that you would expect about Ukraine. But when you read through them, 4 of those points at least were actually targeted as messages towards the U.S. Messages like stop using military blocks as a political maneuver. In other words, the expansion of NATO. Stop using sanctions as a tool of economic warfare, etc. So it was a coded message in many ways. Yes, on the one hand, suggesting that they were the right party to broker this peace in Ukraine, but also very clearly sending out a very strong message to the U.S. about their perception of the U.S.'s involvement in this conflict.
All right, before we get to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and China's role there, let's focus more on China's role in this agreement. As you say, it does position China as a power broker in a region where the U.S. has, for the longest time, had the biggest influence. Keeping in mind, though, that, as you pointed out, the Saudis and the Iranians have been at opposite sides of conflicts in the region, ranging from Syria to Yemen over the past several years. The agreement didn't actually address concerns that the Saudis share with the U.S. and Israel, as you mentioned, about Iran's proxy terrorist forces in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. It also didn't mention Iran's ballistic missile program. It also leaves unaddressed Iran's nuclear program. So given this and given Iran's role in so many proxy wars in the region, as we mentioned, Saudi Arabia on the other side of those conflicts, do you see this having broader implications for the Middle East?
My concern is that this is going to be more symbolic than substantive. In that I do not know whether Iran will live up to its side of the bargain in this and with what has been agreed so far. There's some things they can do very easily, some things are more complicated. But you asked the right question, which is this really going to lead to fundamental change and reform? And I said at the opening that I think only time will tell, because it's very unclear to me, other than, again, Iran being very interested in reestablishing relationships, getting out of pariah status, whether they are going to be willing to do the things that they will need to do. And you mentioned it, which would be to back off on some of these actions that they are taking to destabilize regions in the Middle East, regions that Saudi Arabia cares a great deal about. And they, as we've said, have been in conflict in these regions in Yemen and Syria for quite some time now. Let's focus
a little bit more on what this means for Israel balking at this agreement. Iran was a common threat in the region, bringing the Saudis and Israel together under the thinking of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this also comes as Iran has enriched some uranium to almost 84% purity. That's just shy of the 90% needed for weapons grades material. Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, recently saying that a, quote, horrible nuclear war will break out if the world does not stop Tehran from obtaining atomic weapons. And for the longest time, there was this idea that Israel and the Saudis could be on the verge of some kind of diplomatic breakthrough, that there had been clandestine security cooperation agreements in the attempt of thwarting Iran's nuclear ambitions. What do you think this means for relations between Israel and the Saudis?
I think it's a net negative. You've mentioned, that they had made soft steps and approaches towards each other in the last couple of years. I think there's been a slight improvement in that relationship. This, as a net, can't be helpful. Again, the question goes to how substantive it is, or whether this is going to be more show than anything else. The point you raise is that clearly for Israel, Iran is the existential threat, and they have said as much. Their leadership have been very, very vocal that Israel is the enemy. That has not changed. There's nothing in this agreement that implies that anything will change there. And the question, perhaps going back to China's role, is whether China can be a strong enough hand or influential enough hand with Iran to dissuade them from pursuing their nuclear weapons capabilities, and certainly the rhetoric hasn't stopped in terms of their view of Israel. So we'll see whether China can actually make a difference there, either publicly or at least behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you point out, if China takes a more aggressive role in trying to curtail Iran's nuclear ambitions. Tehran quite clearly stating that their goal is to, quote, wipe Israel off the map. So definitely an existential threat as far as Israel is concerned. But like you say, still very early on in this deal and still a lot to be determined just how fundamentally this agreement will be upheld by Iran and what it means for other areas of potential cooperation between Iran and the Saudis. But one of the aspects that we're clear on is this idea of supplying oil to China. They are both major suppliers of oil to China. They have both been part of OPEC. Together, they supply about 30% of the world's oil supply. So what are the implications for the oil market with this deal, Michael, especially in light of the petrodollar coming into question of late?
Well, so this is a continuation of what we've seen over the last few months, going back to MBS's snub of President Biden when President Biden traveled to request the Saudis to increase production, and when was rebuffed, declined. Along with that came a turning of the face away from the U.S. towards both China and Russia. You mentioned the petrodollar regime that we've been a part of for a half a century now is now in question with recent news that Saudi Arabia will accept the yuan. Are we entering the petro-yuan era? I don't know. But it's clearly a turning away from this longstanding relationship that has existed between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. really since the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s, where previous to that, the U.S. was very cozy with the Iranian regime. And of course, that all came unwound with the taking of hostages and the revolution, et cetera. And over that time, we built a strong relationship, a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. That seems to be at risk right now.
Do you see it having any kind of immediate impact on the oil market?
I think there are so many other factors going on in the oil markets right now, including ongoing sanctions, other issues that I don't know that it has an immediate effect. I do think it's long-term significant, but over time we know that especially oil markets can be very volatile. A lot of things can change over time. I don't know that it has a near-term impact. Yeah.
All right. Let's focus on what this could mean for the potential BRICS alliance, because we do know that Saudi Arabia and Iran have both applied to join the BRICS countries. That's the alliance of nations, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And we've discussed a number of times on this show the hypothesis that a new global reserve currency will emerge from the BRICS, possibly backed by gold and other commodities, and that this global reserve currency would lead to the bifurcation of the global monetary system and compete with the US dollar, and that this is partially a byproduct of the weaponization of the US dollar. Michael, is the fact that China mediated this recent deal between the Saudis and the Iranians perhaps a prelude to accepting the two nations into the BRICS alliance? Does a signal that could be further along in their partnership in joining the BRICS?
What's very clear is that the role that China is playing is a leader role. They are the alpha dog in this whole relationship, in this new engagement. And I absolutely think that they are highly motivated to, on the one hand, to act as that orchestrator to bring these parties together. And yes, I do think it has to do with this BRICS plus idea, this expansion of that. But underlying it is what is essentially a Chinese Communist Party-led anti-American strategy that is designed to realign these nations, to realign strategic interests, realign economic interests. This is not necessarily new, but it's something that is accelerating, that's been ratcheting up recently. A big milestone marker was going all the way back to 2014 when the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia around Crimea. That was a warning bell, I think, for China, for Russia, and others. And this process of questioning the potential for de-dollarization, for moving away from the U.S. dollar-denominated global financial markets, that process began 10 years ago now. And so we're seeing it in, let's call it sanctions 2.0 against Russia, the beginning stages of actually implementing some of those solutions, alternative payment mechanisms outside of SWIFT, alternatives to the petrodollar regime, recognizing that, and again, even I mentioned some of the things that China said in their so-called 12-point peace plan for Ukraine. They were very focused on this issue of weaponization of the dollar, on the sanctions regime as a tool, effectively, of warfare. So if you look at this, on the one hand, they're taking this more visible role of global diplomacy, of leader in the great power conflict, which is a conflict in their view with the U.S. But on the other hand, they're seeking to avoid direct conflict with the U.S., so not wanting to embroil themselves too deeply, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, not wanting to end up in a direct conflict with the U.S., whether it be over Taiwan or over any other issues. Keep in mind that the U.S. and China have a $50 billion a month trading relationship. 3/4 of that is Chinese exports to the U.S., U.S. imports. And so you call it net exports, $2.5 trillion or so a year for China in a $20 trillion economy. It's a big deal. And I think China is, while you've heard this increase in bellicose language from Chinese officials, and almost this tit for tat ratcheting up of threats and intimidations, underlying all of that is the fact that China right now cannot live without the U.S., nor can the U.S. live without China from a trading perspective.
Well, and the idea of potentially decoupling the economies has sort of been out there, certainly since the Trump administration was highlighting the potential imbalances in the trade relationships between the U.S. and China, and this notion of a potential decoupling has been on the horizon since. Do you see that decoupling accelerating?
Absolutely. So you're 100% right that it was Trump who first pulled the facade off of this Potemkin village of a relationship between China and the U.S. The smiling faces and waving hands were in the background. There was all this stuff going on, espionage, issues with a double standard of treatment of companies, U.S. companies in China, et cetera. That was the beginning. We've actually entered into a new and darker phase of this, in that the Biden administration, by and large, has not abandoned those Trump-era policies regarding China, and in some ways has actually stiffened them. So look at the CHIPS Act that was passed and signed into law in the fall of 2022, which basically, while on the one hand providing, I believe it's $280 billion of stimulus across the programs to encourage the U.S. semiconductor industry, AI industry, et cetera. At the same time, it imposed restrictions on export to China, including export of equipment and technology that would help them advance in semiconductor technology or in AI technology. This, I think, was a real threat to China. I think one of the things that Chinese leadership are reacting to comes out of this, because, to your point, we are actually tightening on both sides the terms of trade and making it more difficult, recognizing that the U.S. faces its largest competitive threat from China. And this is going to be a problem. On the other hand, the unintended consequence of the Biden administration's actions around semiconductors and AI is actually furthering, again, just like with sanctions, question, is it actually encouraging the development of a Chinese domestic semiconductor and AI capability over time? And that is a potential risk to the U.S.
And I do want to focus more on this whole idea of the semiconductor industry and how Taiwan fits into this picture and getting the Europeans to cooperate. But before we do that, I still want to highlight this BRICS alignment and how this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China, may accelerate that process and may accelerate this bifurcation of the global monetary system. We do know that the BRICS will be meeting in August in Durban of South Africa. Do you think, again, that this kind of de facto suggests that Iran and Saudi Arabia would be part of this alliance and could therefore accelerate this global reserve currency backed by commodities?
Yes. And one of the reasons I think that is because look at the acceleration in pace of these discussions, of meetings, of plenaries, of behind the scenes staffers working nearly around the clock in these countries to address what is a very, very complex issue. Global payments, alternative currency. This isn't something you can just flip the switch on. But the amount of investment of time, senior level attention, resources, and capital, and from a perspective, China, Russia, others are looking for as strong of a coalition, as strong of a base as possible as an alternative to, again, the U.S. dollar-denominated global financial system How do they do that? Well, by bringing allies into the fold. Iran's already outside of the U.S. dollar regime. That is an easier one, an easier win. Saudi Arabia has a difficult choice, because are they really going to turn their back completely on the U.S. in order to pursue this? But I think they're, in a way, dancing with the devil and waiting to see how this will play out. Your question, is this a signal that BRICS Plus is looking for new dance partners and expanding beyond its core? I believe that's absolutely true.
Okay, well, Michael, I know that you have done a lot of business and a lot of work in Africa and in developing countries. If you see this as a trend and you're an investor, and again, definitely not necessarily supporting this trend, but if you're an investor and this looks to be inevitable and potentially even imminent, how do you position yourself to take advantage of the situation? Would you recommend that investors consider deploying capital into BRICS countries, into BRICS-related assets, for example?
My personal view is no. And the reason for that is because I do believe that the dollar is going to continue to be strong. I've talked recently that I was wrong on this issue a couple of years ago, that I was anticipating a greater dollar weakness in the face of all the things that we're seeing, inflation, et cetera. But I do believe that for the moment, even if it is long-term going to struggle and lose its position as a dominant, as a global reserve currency, in the meantime, it is still a very strong factor. And one of the things that you can see, certainly over the last decade, the BRICS countries' currencies have not performed well against the dollar. That was certainly the issue in Africa and in other places. But you're absolutely right that you are going to continue to see underlying GDP growth, underlying growth in places like India, South Africa is a member. I have lost confidence in terms of the Cyril Ramaphosa's government and ability to turn things around there. The situation is deteriorating, as it is in Mexico, from a political and crime standpoint. China, which would be the other big piece of the BRICS, faces very significant domestic economic challenges. The property market is in disarray. The consumer is extremely weak. Yes, you have reopening right now. That's a good thing. But exports are also falling in this global reshifting. So when I think about this from an investment perspective, it isn't necessarily to say we should go out and invest in China, we should go out and invest in Brazil or these other countries at the moment. Where I think there is long-term opportunity is in the middle of this reordering of the world order, this realignment of nations that we've been talking about. That comes with it a massive supply chain upheaval. So I think it's important to look at where opportunities are. Now, as part of the same initiative, we'll get into it perhaps in a bit more, around semiconductors, around AI. Over the long run, those technologies are areas where the U.S. ought to have opportunity to win. So let's call those two categories of investment around tech and innovation in those areas. But I also think more fundamentally, a reordering of basic materials, rare earth minerals, for example, where the dependence on China has been extreme. There are a number of earlier stage initiatives in the U.S. with the full backing and support of the U.S. government to find alternatives. Cobalt's an example, but you can look across the value chain, supply chain for a lot of rare earths, important strategic minerals, and that's happening right now. So I think there is a further opportunity in that area as well. And while I hate to say it, the other big opportunity, which you can see, is in the defense industry. We're already spending, what is it now, approaching $800 trillion in the U.S. And recognizing, and it's not terribly well spent, but this is going to be a boon for the defense industry for the foreseeable future, for the next decade. So when I speak of these things, I'm not speaking of what's going to happen between now and July. These are more long-term. Where might we be in 5-10 years? What ought to do well through this cycle and this massive shift in the world order? Right.
And defense spending is definitely something I want to hit on. But just to confirm, you're saying that although you're seeing this trend, the play from an investor's perspective is not to sort of align themselves with the BRICS alliance and potential there, but rather to look at how the global trade system is going to be bifurcated, how there's going to be sort of a balkanization of supply chains, and position yourself on the other side where the split is going to come towards the West, meaning focus on companies that are going to have to come up as an alternative to getting commodities and to getting resources from BRICS countries.
And what I should have mentioned, Michelle, is that I'm speaking as and to a U.S. or Western investor, someone based in Europe, in the U.S. and Canada, elsewhere, as opposed to as a Chinese person or company or Russian or otherwise. First of all, for U.S. persons and businesses, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on Russia in terms of business activity, investing in the markets, et cetera. One of the risks I foresee with China is what we've seen already, which is this increasing restriction on Chinese access to U.S. capital markets, increasing restrictions, perhaps even in the future, similarly on business and investing activity for U.S. persons in China. So that's why I say in that 5 to 10 year view, these big geopolitical, geostrategic issues are going to swing investment decisions in ways that are beyond the control of an investor to manage.
Okay, some investors, but okay, I get that there's a lot of, I guess that there's a lot of to be determined factors here. Let's bring it back to something that has been determined, and that is President Xi effectively making himself president for life. As we mentioned, he has just got these 2 big diplomatic victories with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and even putting China out there as a broker between Russia and Ukraine. He's also consolidated power quite significantly, unanimously elected Chinese president on Friday at the ongoing session of China's national legislature. And he was also elected chairman of the Central Military Commission of the People's Republic of China, also by a unanimous vote. Is this an unprecedented consolidation of power here, Michael? And what are the consequences?
Well, so it is not unprecedented in that it is part of the Chinese political tradition to consolidate power in these places. What is interesting, and this I think is the story of the decade, is that Xi has been remarkably effective in consolidating power, in bringing all of these different parts of government under his control, in eliminating political opponents and enemies along the way, and as you pointed out, ensuring that there are no structural barriers to that consolidation of power. We had this strange incident in the Party Congress in November where Hu Jintao was forcibly exited from the DS from that. Now that was blamed on maybe he was not feeling well or otherwise. Whatever it was clearly a symbolic message about the concentration of power. It was a little bit Stalin-esque in how it came across. But
it wasn't so forcibly exited, but he was exited.
He did not go willingly. This was not something that he wanted to do. You could see him resisting and pulling back. So I actually don't think it was something that he intended or wanted to have happen. You see him trying to speak to Chairman Xi, trying to speak to others, and him being sort of tugged by the shirt sleeves. So no, it wasn't violent in any sense, but symbolic.
The official narrative was that he wasn't feeling well.
I understand.
Yeah.
And he may not, I wouldn't have been feeling very well at that moment either. But I do think that, again, he has appeared in public several weeks later at a funeral, but he has definitely gotten the message and his political life is over. And again, it's the symbolism here of the concentration of power in the hands of Chairman Xi.
So we've got President Xi consolidating power here. Which, as we said, means that he's got very few rivals who would stand in the way of his agenda. And interestingly enough, we've got a new Chinese foreign minister, and he's made some interesting comments lately. Mr. Qin saying that conflict and confrontation with the United States is inevitable if Washington does not change course, saying if the U.S. does not put on the brakes and continues to roar down the wrong road, no amount of guardrails can stop the derailment and overturning, and it's bound to fall into conflict and confrontation. Who will bear its disastrous consequences? That is the word from the new Chinese foreign minister. He also said that the diplomatic crisis caused by the balloon incident could have been averted, but that the U.S. acted with the presumption of guilt on China. Coupled with President Xi calling for a faster buildup of the military, how concerned should we be about this rhetoric?
Well, what concerns me is that the accelerating pace of the escalation. This is the story that people are missing. That we're very focused on the conflict in Ukraine, and on the other side of the world, the conflict between the U.S. and China is escalating at a pace that is remarkable. We've talked about some of the elements of it all the way back. Even think about the loss of trust that has occurred between the nations coming out of 2020. The Wuhan virus, everything that came out of there, where now U.S. government institutions like the FBI, like the Department of Energy, are finally saying out loud what many people had some reason to believe on circumstantial evidence. For example, that the virus, the pandemic launched in the shadow of one of the world's most dangerous biological labs. Coincidence, as Sherlock Holmes said, if there's a body and a weapon, you pretty much know that a murder has been committed. But the government, because of diplomatic restraint, did not say that for nearly 3 years. Well, now the gloves are coming off on both sides, and stronger messages are going across. It is the removal of the veneer of civility in the diplomatic dialogue that is a prelude to even greater conflict. What I would say, however, is that we have already been, certainly in this era since 2020, of increasing facets of forms of warfare by other means. Outside of kinetic war, outside of hot wars, whether it be cyber attacks, information technology, disinformation, all of the things that we've seen have absolutely been accelerating. Think also about the increasing aggression of China in the South China Sea and vis-a-vis Taiwan. And that is just one of, we could go through hundreds of examples where the pace of engagement has accelerated.
Well, there certainly has been this Cold War happening in the background for several years now. It does feel, though, Michael, as though it's starting to heat up. But how likely is an actual kinetic war here?
Well, you run danger of it when you have these kind of military engagements between conflicting aircraft or ships at sea or otherwise. And by the way, I will go as far as to say you could view the conflict in Ukraine as, well, of course it is about Russia and Ukraine. In a way, this is the first proxy war between the U.S. on the one hand and China on the other hand that we've seen in 70 years since the Korean War.
But China hasn't really stepped up in terms of supporting Russia militarily yet.
Well, perhaps. I think they have taken some steps, or certainly engaged in the conversation. They are buying Russian oil, picking up the slack. So supporting a wartime economy is support. Now, you're right. They're showing restraint. As I mentioned earlier, China does not want to be out front here on these kind of issues. So no, they're not providing, for example, hypersonic missiles and things like that, which, by the way, Russia just deployed this week against Ukraine, which is another technology where China does have a lead, and it presents a real risk for the U.S. militarily. So I would take a different view and say economic support in a war like this, in a conflict like this, is support and is engaging with a proxy.
Well, we do know that Iran has been supporting Russia, sending the so-called kamikaze drones to Russia. And as I mentioned earlier on, Chinese companies are supplying Iran with parts that are necessary to make those drones. And hence, the Biden administration has just slapped some sanctions on those Chinese companies. And this trend could certainly continue and accelerate if more Chinese companies get involved in logistics support on the military side, and perhaps it even escalates to China full on helping Russia with more weapons. But as you quite rightly point out, China does have this kind of at an arm's length approach to this conflict, so far at least. I want to touch on this idea of, all of a sudden, it seems like many in the US on a federal level are acknowledging that it's highly, highly likely that the COVID-19 virus came from that virology lab in Wuhan, something that many people have been, as you say, saying seemed the more obvious conclusion for the longest time. Why do you think there's been this sort of change in narrative? And also pointing out that the House unanimously voted to declassify some of the information on the COVID-19 virus origins. What do you think is behind this change in mentality in the U.S.?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, we mentioned this ratcheting escalation of rhetoric and conflict. And so I think the gloves have come off in some ways, that stronger messages are going back and forth on both sides. But you mentioned this declassifying and sort of the increased amount of information that is now being made publicly available. I don't think, well, although to my knowledge, the Biden administration proper, in other words, the White House, has not come out and said themselves that they agree with this conclusion. So they're still holding back from that front. Yeah. But the FBI, Department of Energy, others have said it. And of course, President Trump said it 3 years ago, that this was the most likely outcome. That hasn't changed for a lot of the intelligence agencies who knew this all along. I think the pressure and the fact that with the change of control in the House, we're seeing, of course, all these hearings around disclosure of some of the lies and untruths that went on during that period of 2000, the last couple of years, that this is part and parcel of it, that it was no longer going to be possible for certain parts of government to maintain silence on the issue or to maintain denial of what appears to be a very likely source of the virus.
Do you think it may have a role in perhaps laying groundwork for support for a confrontation with China, should it come to that?
I think it's another log on the fire. I don't think, for example, the question of virus origins will never actually be completely resolved. China's still a closed country. Information will not flow out. Our intelligence agencies, our government will draw a conclusion. Will we then go to war and retribution or seek recompense for the billions or trillions of dollars that were lost globally in the economy? I don't know. I don't think so. But I do think it is another log on the fire in this increasing tension between the two global powers.
Let's talk very quickly about the idea of Taiwan and the role it plays in supplying the world with chips, with semiconductors, and how investors could be positioning themselves with regards to developments there.
So this is an interesting one. Aside from national unity and the idea of one China, China is clearly interested in Taiwan's semiconductor and other technologies. It's quite important. I wrote earlier this year that I believe that China would continue to bark but not bite at Taiwan because they're very smart about this, very strategic, very thoughtful. They're not going to do something impulsive. And to launch an invasion of Taiwan today, in my view, would be terribly impulsive and short-sighted and self-defeating. Again, going back to the primacy of the trading relationship with the U.S., the importance of getting their domestic economy back on foot. Keep in mind that they had a lot of social unrest and riots just a few months ago around this COVID-0 policy where people were finally just fed up. So they have to get their domestic economy, their house in order. They've got to get back to a growth footing. On the other hand, Taiwan's technology and capability is a very tempting and tasty target for them. So I do think this will continue to be the focus of the issue. And in my best estimation, it is a flashpoint that we will see, not this year, unlikely, but within the next 5 years where we could see a problem there.
All right, Michael, there are a ton of issues that arise from this conversation, including could the U.S. expect European cooperation in confronting China militarily and confronting China economically, because the Europeans have been a tad reluctant to do so far. We don't have time to unpack all of that because I know we have a hard out with you. But final question, given all of these developments and factors that are still very much to be determined, if you had to deploy $5 million with a 10-year holding period, what would your strategy be?
Well, in a way, I kind of alluded to that earlier when I talked about, if you think about, let's just qualify it, I think, from the U.S. perspective, from investing perspective, long-term horizon, not short-term, what are these big themes that are likely to drive going forward? So we've got shifting alliances, shifting supply chains, the return of resource nationalism. So this idea of investing around themes that are going to benefit a shifting alliance where the U.S. begins to rethink all sorts of things. It is not going to be easy to rebuild U.S. manufacturing capabilities process knowledge has been lost over the last couple of years. But I do like on the more esoteric end of the spectrum, or more advanced end of the spectrum, advances in AI, advances in quantum computing I think are going to be fundamental. Reshoring of semiconductor capability, of other capabilities in the tech space. We have an opportunity to lead globally in crypto and blockchain if we don't mess it up through regulatory overburden. But then I also go back to issues around energy security, food security, which have been big themes of mine for over a decade. And it's why, by the way, I also get concerned. I think many states across the U.S. are getting concerned about the Chinese acquisition of U.S. farmland as another issue. So I still, over that long-term horizon, am positive on the commodities complex, positive on oil, positive on gold, and then on some of those specific, more venture-ish technology investments that could pay dividends, not in 5 years, but in a decade.
Can you quickly give us a way to specifically play any of these ideas?
Well, there are a number of companies that are investing around it, even some of the larger existing tech companies. I've not been a fan of tech growth recently. There's been just so much going on in the space. But I would, again, look at opportunities where what you didn't say was if I had 5 million and I had to find existing public companies. And that's going to be the challenge, because a lot of those things are still in that more private market, earlier stage level. But I wouldn't be surprised to see, because these are themes that are becoming more and more important, publicly available vehicles coming to play that take advantage of them. You know, the SPAC market is oftentimes derided, but occasionally becomes a great way for investors to get into emerging technologies that are finding a way to get to access to public markets.
Okay, Michael, we will have to have you back on to give us specifics on that one. Appreciate your time and insight as always, Michael Wilkerson. Thank you for joining us.
All the best.
All right, and thank you for watching Kitco. If you're watching us on YouTube, remember to subscribe. I'm Michelle Makori. We'll see you soon.